with more on the diplomatic implications of the progress in Ramadi. I'm joined right now by Christian Whiton. He is a former State Department senior advisor. Christian, thanks for joining us. I'm sure you heard the Colonel's comments, this idea that perhaps the U.S.-led coalition, along with Iraq, is setting up success for Iran. Do you see that as an unintended consequence?
Yeah, I think there is that real problem, especially, again, you have this government in Baghdad that is Shiite-dominated, Shiite supremacist, and even though they did a little bit cosmetically to have the liberation of Ramadi look like something different, you're still stuck with this problem that Sunni Arabs are basically through with Baghdad. This is going to make it very difficult to hold Ramadi, somewhat easy for ISIS potentially to come back, and we're still stuck with this foreign policy, not just the United States, but most of the West, where we are pretending that Iraq is still a unitary country when, in fact, it really looks like three different countries.
It does, in fact. And just talking about Ramadi, the bright spot here, as the Colonel was mentioning, I mean, it is important. It has key roads going into Syria. It has key roads, access roads for other points, Jordan as well. But it doesn't sound like net you think that this is a great move in the fight against terrorism.
No, I think it's very limited. ISIS still has control of basically most of the water and a lot of the roads and a lot of the strategically important parts of western Iraq and eastern Syria. But also, ISIS is not contained. That's something that the president has said in the past, and I'm sure we'll hear it again after Ramadi has thankfully been taken from ISIS. But look elsewhere around the world. If you look at Libya in particular, ISIS has basically made a hinterland there. It now patrols the streets of Sirte in Libya, and you can expect other cities to fall as well. You have ISIS turning up in Central Asia and places like Bangladesh. You have the defense minister in Singapore saying that ISIS has gained more adherents in the last 2 or 3 years than al-Qaeda did in the entire decade after 9/11. So politically, diplomatically, this is still a force that is on the march, and of course, to say nothing of its recent inroads in Paris and out here in California.
So one reason, Christian, to your point, that ISIS seems so, I'm putting this in quotation marks, is successful is because they do seem to be masters of media, masters of recruiting. On that note, I want to bring in its PR response to Ramadi, this 24-minute recording released, shared on social media this weekend. So it features an ISIS leader essentially telling terrorist soldiers to be patient because they are on the right path, and the U.S.-led alliance should not scare them. Now, in reaction here in New York, Congressman Peter King, you know him, the chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security, saying, in fact, there's truth in the message because the U.S. and Russia have done little to halt this army of bloodthirsty militants.
Unfortunately, I think overall he's probably right that after 16 months of air attacks by the U.S., it's had really minimal impact on ISIS, considering how long those attacks have been going on.
So, Christian, it sounds like you agree with the congressman.
I think there's a lot of validity to that. I mean, if you look at the fact that this ragtag army, supposedly the JV team, has been able to stand up to the United States and a U.S.-led coalition for almost 2 years now. I mean, World War II took 3.5 years for the United States. It's obviously there's some problems with that comparison, but this is the problem is they've had something taken away from them, but it's not enough to change the dynamic. And ISIS really has surpassed other groups like al-Qaeda, political groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in typifying Islamism globally, and we haven't even scratched the surface. We haven't even declared a policy of resisting Islamism. So we're stuck in the weeds discussing Assad and these various rebel groups in Syria without a real clear plan to kill ISIS and maybe leave some of these other problems for people in the region to solve or not solve.
So, Christian, on that note, with the Muslim Brotherhood and other groups that are thought to feed certain branches of terrorists, especially in the Middle East, Congressman King weighed in on that. For those who didn't hear, we're going to play his comments now.
Should there be more surveillance in the Muslim communities? The answer is yes. And there should not be restrictions put on the police. The reality is solid police work means you go where the threat is coming from, and the threat is coming from the Muslim community.
So obviously, Congressman, focusing a little bit closer to home, that's a very controversial stance here. France, for its part, has done it. It has put certain mosques on a watch list if they are thought to have radical imams. Should the U.S. consider those moves?
Well, we should do what's worked in the past. And where you said in New York City that NYPD, the police department, actually did, I think, some very thoughtful, very important work, especially after 9/11, at the end of Giuliani and during the Bloomberg administrations, which is to cooperate with Muslim leaders. But, of course, you conduct surveillance where the problems are. We're somewhat blessed in the United States that Muslims have integrated here much more than they have in Europe. But there are going to be some bad apples, and you have to keep an eye on them. Unfortunately, some politicians don't like that, and the name of civil liberties have pulled that back, including in New York City. So restoring that, copying that program elsewhere in the United States, looking at Cold War measures that made life difficult for communists and applying that today to Islamists, things like updating the McCarran Act, declaring Islamists, or actually first defining Islamism, the ideology of radical Islam, excluding those people from the United States, defining them as inadmissible aliens. These are things we've done in the past to tackle these ideological opponents that we haven't quite gotten around to today, even though it's been, some time since the recent attacks here in the United States and more than a decade since 9/11. We've done these things well in the past, and we could do them again.
All right, Christian, great to have you here. Thank you for the time. Christian Whiton joining me there, former State Department senior advisor.